So this panel is dedicated to Randolph Glanville, and the title of the panel is A Conversation About Design and Designing with a Conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to have each of the panelists introduce themselves. So I'll begin. I'm Joseph Choma, Assistant Professor of Architecture at Clemson University and founder of Design Topology Lab, which is an interdisciplinary design research lab.
Patrick Harrop from Montreal and Sudbury, Ontario, and I'm one of the founding members of the McEwen School of Architecture at Laurentian University.
I'm Mark Goldfeld. I'm a professor of architecture at MIT.
Go for it.
Ted Krieger, Associate Professor of Architecture at Rensselaer Polytechnic.
I'm Nathan.
Please. No.
I'm sorry. I'm Nathan.
The volume.
I'm Nathan Feldy. I'm a professor of design at Northeastern University, and I'm here as a result of a triangulation of relationship with Joe Choma and Paul Pangaro. Paul, with whom I've had a conversation for 40 years, which led me to meet Gordon Pask and have some interaction with him. So I'm the useful idiot because I'm a designer.
My name is Daisy Ames. I'm an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia University and founder of Studio Ames, all based in New York City.
Great. In conversation, participants find themselves discussing topics they never thought of when they began, and they may find radical new ideas in and through the conversation. So we're about to have a conversation, and before we start that conversation, I'm going to read a series of fragments or collages of some of Randolph's works, and that'll jumpstart the conversation here. Designing and conversation are both like wandering. With a picnic hamper in hand, there is a purpose to the activity, but is not the main point. I enter the wood. I have nothing in mind except the hope that eventually to find a place to have a picnic. I'm wandering. Without any particular reason, I move onward in some direction, and after a moment something catches my eye. I follow it, and making an unpredictable number of difficult to justify choices, I eventually find myself somewhere lovely. It's just perfect. I sit down, open my hamper, and enjoy my picnic. I can now, after the event, explain how I got here, but at that time there was no reasoning. I just ended up at this wonderful place eating my picnic. It's bliss. It may not, of course, be the best place for the picnic, but who knows where that is? But it's good enough. It fits the moment. It's magic. It's in this sense, and only in this sense, it is perfect. The process of doodling works like this. The designer makes some marks on a piece of paper. This marks is more of a question than a statement. It is tentative and uncertain, and often certainly an absent-minded scribble. It may be any shape that comes to mind, or even quite undirected shape. Looking at it, the designer draws some more, often emphasizing bits of the original, changing bits, adding bits, drawing over or erasing, wandering about and through it. Sometimes the bits of interest are copied and the doodle is started again. Sometimes an alternative is produced. Sometimes the process is enriched by adding aspects that are directed to make it richer. Sometimes the original is just discarded. And at some point the doodle becomes more particularly focused, a particular form is developed and explored. At that point we might say the doodle has become a sketch. If the designer works in a group with others, they may draw on each other's doodles and sketches, borrowing from them, giving to them, to each other. The process is circular. I, as designer, move from drawing to viewing to drawing, in a potentially endless circular switch between the two. Designers learn to take the two roles themselves. They learn to switch between viewer and drawer, and sometimes very rapidly. One draws as one draws as one views as one draws. The designer takes on both roles, therefore holding a conversation with him or herself via paper and pencil. The primary act at the heart of designing, the conversation with the self. So with that, I'd like the panelists to discuss what kind of conversations they have when they design.
Well, I just concluded a 50-year conversation with, unfortunately, due to the death of the other part of the conversation, my partner in design practice from when I first had the nerve to announced that I was a designer, which Herbert Mouchamp says is kind of like a conceit. So this quote that you forwarded to us to contemplate had a particularly poignant effect on me. So I'm looking back 50 years. I was also able to go back to our studio from the way I left it in 1980 when I went to MIT, and see things there that were as I had put them in the studio on the wall. So there was exactly what was described was exactly what we did. We connected intellectually, socially, I guess, or culturally. And I think the conversation each day began with, what do you want to do today? And initially we decided that we should accomplish whatever it is we came up with by midnight of that day without any particular client in mind. And that's how the practice grew. So I've just spent some time thinking about a 50-year conversation which came to closure, which is kind of a fascinating thing to have in your life.
I've been having a series of conversations with Greg Ulmer, who's just retired. He's a professor at University of Florida and a theorist, I'd say a philosopher of technology, or apparatus theory, as he says. And he's I get a cup of coffee and he gets a cup of coffee, and he's in warm Florida, I'm in cold Boston, and we just chit chat. And he's very interested by architecture and the plastic arts. His son went through architecture school, his daughter-in-law went through architecture school, but his overriding interest is to try to map out shifts in pedagogy as we move from what he calls literacy to electracy. So the base ontology is shifting, and he's written some 5 or 6 books trying to articulate that, and he's extraordinary at taking you back through history in order to alert you to similar changes that have happened, through history. He's particularly fascinated by architecture as what he thinks of as an avant-garde pedagogy. It's been a very interesting 30, 40, 50 years of inventive pedagogy, what he calls heuretic versus hermeneutic. So he comes at it not innocently, but wanting to understand what this experiment has entailed. And so it's led to a lot of very interesting, it's given me more insight into the sort of history of pedagogy and of technology, and I think it's given him greater insight into the curious way in which we as a tribe operate. I'd certainly say at MIT what I recognize is that everybody is suddenly wanting to do design. So Ulmer's point is that it's part of a general tendency that he thinks is inevitable as we move from literacy to electracy, and I could try to flesh those out. But I was struck in your description of the picnic. We had a picnic this weekend and found ourselves tramping through mosquito-infested woods, and then finally found a little clearing overlooking Gloucester Bay, which was the perfect spot. So we sat there. We ate our picnic with my one boy is 7, one is 17. We were surrounded by blueberry bushes, and even though they weren't really ripe, we ate them. Didn't taste very good, but it was sort of perfect in its moment. And then as we left the picnic spot, of course, you then Google berries that look like blueberries in the American woods, which is sort of the reversal of linearity, right? And then you discover that one of the things that you're likely to mistake is hemlock. And so that took me back to my conversations with Greg about Socrates. And Socrates, of course, was poisoned with hemlock. He was sentenced to death for sedition of youth, in fact, for impiety. And Socrates, of course, was perhaps the first in the tradition of defining literacy. And if you cast yourself back to that moment, the technology of the moment was was the alphabet, was the phonetic alphabet. And even though Socrates didn't write, he was certainly very instrumental in thinking through what this new mnemonic device would mean, and in engaging the citizens of Athens who hated him for it, for reasoning. So he adopted the device of dialogue as the exemplary instrument of a new literate intellection. And so he would force people to confront things like, why would you murder your brother for impiety? How do you rationalize that? You know? So he was dispatched for asking very difficult questions, and his disciple Plato then formulated it much more fully. But I would say, as I read through Ranulph's thing about conversation, for me, dialogue is the device of training, of shifting humanity from oralcy to literacy. And literacy is not written oralcy, it's a completely different level of intellection that's suddenly made possible by this new mnemonic, and it's the birth of proto-science. And so, particularly in Phaedrus' conversations with Socrates, Plato maps out the new intellection, and it is one of selfhood. So selfhood emerges at that point. Socrates is often held to be the first self. It is a new form of intellection. It's complex reasoning. So it's alphanumeric reasoning is being invented and defined, and of course they then define the institution, school, by which you will gain this. And so with Plato comes the first academy, and then Aristotle institutionalizes it. And it's really been that way ever since. So there's the adoption of a new technology, a new apparatus in Greg Elmer's terms, which always carries three dimensions to it. It changes intellection, it changes personal identity, and it requires new social institutions to support that new ontology. And so Alma's greatest interest is, as we shift from what he calls literacy to electracy, so on the back of photo, computational apparati, what is it that's going on in terms of those three registers? So how is intellection changing? How is personal identity changing? And what are the institutions that will support that? And so that's why he's quizzing me about this experiment in creative pedagogy in order to try to find something other than dialogue. Dialogue. So when I read, my casual and provocative thing to you is, I am not a self. I do not design. Or at least I aspire not to design. I aspire not to be a self. I look for for institutionalizing practices which then find the new identity formations and intellections that will be native to electracy. And I think they are profoundly changing profoundly. And I do think that all the words here, words like design, they have a history, they have meant something. That's changed through history, and it's sure as hell changing right now. And it's one of those very strange terms that's elusive. It isn't a certain term. It's like technology. It's become extremely opaque. And yet they do have a history, and I think at a time of transition it really merits going back and trying to ask for some clarity about what these terms did mean or why they meant what they meant, in order to then try to propose how they might be shifting in the present. So,
for me, I think it's difficult to say that you're not a self, though. I can understand that we are a collective, but even within the collective, each individual constructs their own reality. And so
Alma would say oral civilization, spirit; literate civilization, self; electric civilization, avatar. So it's often a much more complex social definition, and you see that in the multiple identities of kids using social media. It's a much more elusive thing than this self-certain rationalized. So I would put it up there that selfhood is not something that is necessarily fixed, and it's not necessarily something we should be aspiring to.
But I think
there are other formations of personal identity that could be, that are probably in the offing. If you learn from history, every time there's been a shift in major technology, personal definitions change. And I would say selfhood began with Socrates and probably ends with Kant. Yeah?
Just maybe I'll just say one more thing, which is you also mentioned education and pedagogy, and I know as an educator, I try very hard not to teach my students, because if I teach, it suggests emulate, do what I do, or which is a much more rationalist mindset. The goal is, how do I make the student understand? How do I help the student become a reflective practitioner in themselves? I think before they can even engage a larger conversation with the collective like you're describing, they first have to be able to become reflective in themselves, actively engaging it, identifying new opportunities, and that'll in feedback loop. And I don't think it's a very difficult model in the education system because we're so trained based on memory, fixed definitions, to get them where you're getting them. You're just trying to help them along their journey, help them see, or train them to be very careful listeners and observers. I don't know if anyone wants to
Yeah,
jump
I mean,
in.
I think a lot of psychology is based off of the idea that people need to be heard. And as a healing tool, it's been very effective because it gives actually a place and time for which somebody who needs assistance to grow and to understand is able to do that. So teaching actually becomes uses the same tools or at least I use the same tools as a psychologist sometimes, where I'm just there to ask questions and listen, and through that I learned. So it's a type of feedback loop, right? So when they say I'm struggling with this, they might not be using the terms that I would use, but I allow them to kind of find a way to find their personal goal. So as a teacher, it's much more about listening for me and having them pick the right architectural moves, elements, and use the right words. And it's just a slow process of allowing them to feel heard and, in a way, understanding myself through them.
I would go back to your proposition about the self and the demise of the self, and wonder whether they're not replacements in series, but perhaps aggregation, sort of change in emphasis. And so my sense would be what might arise is more about what happens between and amongst people. And as we focus more on that, not in the collective sense, but in the sort of actual sense and how people act, where the test of a design is its etiquette, meaning most of the problems we have today have to do with how people treat each other in aggregate or individually, on a spectrum of etiquette, not just table manners.
So almost, he's constantly making the point that when you see the emergence of a sort of new ontology, so oracy, literacy, they don't entirely displace the former, they augment it. So it's just a new capacity has opened up. But you have to be quite clear that they are antagonistic to a large extent. So currently we have still oral civilizations in existence and literate ones, and in many ways the confrontation between ISIS and the West is that ideological confrontation. In the Renaissance, you saw the same confrontation between church and fledgling science, and possibly in our time, you're going to start seeing the conflict between the academy and the corporation. Because the corporation does not have the same set of values of literacy that the academy is the inheritor of. It simply doesn't. So he says you move from sort of true false to right wrong to true false, and then to pleasure pain. And in literacy, he thinks the animating axes are pleasure pain, which is a much fuller capability of humanity. And so analytical reason goes into inventive reason. And the question for education, he posits as if literacy has favored analytical reason, and that sort of has been the dominant trope, as you pass to literacy, he suggests that it's you're moving to a mode of inventive learning, not analytical learning. And I think that's where he's fascinated by something like architecture, which is that you engage with something that's unknown, and it's a carefully orchestrated. It's a requirement to invent in that space, which demands the sort of full capabilities of human intellect. It's not just a narrow one. And he traces it back to Kant's critique of analytical reason and his requirement that the subjective creativity be brought back into balance because of the Aristotelian theory of poiesis praxis. Poiesis was the creative bit. That slipped out of play for Kant. And so from Kant onwards, there's this sort of drive to re-establishing a sort of full human intellection within its pedagogy. And therefore, the inventive pedagogies are deeply rewarding, and they require that aspect of poiesis.
In that context, I would think cybernetics and design would have a central role, because these are both things that do this sort of inventive aspect of it. One of the things that came to mind when you were talking to students, in terms of becoming reflective practitioners, I usually put it to them that they have to design themselves. So they sort of look to the understanding of design and begin designing how they design, begin designing the kinds of experiences that they have. Usually curriculums start off pretty prescriptive and open up, and they need to engage this design sensibility in order to understand where to go and to continue that as they get out into the world. But it's all this kind of inventive stuff that you're talking about. So
I'm actually a big fan of emulation, and this sort of comes later in my career. But my sense, and I'm glad you brought up Baldwin. I've been a reader of Baldwin for quite a while. My sense is that there is a very strong, I would say, diluted of self when it comes to design, and that's mostly what's happening with avatars, but also with the way that individuals believe that they could actually engage with the world and make with the world. I'm very much into maker culture. It's one of the things that I'm really intrigued by. And what I've noticed is a lot of people are starting to actually believe that they are in control, and they are in control of their environment and what they can make. Just watch a quick Tasty Japan video on how to make, your own custard, that kind of thing. And so it brings up a problem, because a lot of the selves, as you've described, actually believe that they've mastered something, or that mastery is within their reach. And we see that everything from EDM music to video. Yet true invention, and I talked a bit about this yesterday, true invention is related to a very intimate command over material, and not necessarily the idea. And I've described some of the studios that we do in our school, but one of the most important ones, and the one that has the hugest impact, is we work with a lot of First Nations elders, and one elder builds a canoe. And the studio is very simple. The students are not to engage. They're not there to go and build their own canoe. They're there to actually listen for 4 months and just watch and listen. And this is exactly what they demand of us, because they it's been years that they've said, you just don't listen. You just want to immediately engage. It's time for you to listen. And there's a very profound thing that happens in that, because what it does to the self is it actually slows down the entire process, and it slows down the entire synthetic process of making the material. And once that synthetic process slows down, that's where it starts to embed the cultural issues and the cultural layers that go on top of it, and the reasons that go on top of it, and understanding that the wood that you burn for ash to mix with bear fat is not wood which you just go to the store and buy. It's actually wood that comes from the shavings from the actual wood that you're cutting the ribs out of the birch bark canoe itself. And there's a very complete picture that starts to emerge in it. And there's a very big crisis of confidence with most of the students immediately after that, because it's like, oh wow, that might be sushi, that it might look like sushi that I'm making, but it actually isn't sushi. It even might taste like that. So for me, emulation is a very important part of it, because along with actualizing and inventing and being able to make as a designer, what always gets misinterpreted is that we don't need the material knowledge of it to do it. And we profoundly need that. That material ability, when we speak about the doodle, it's a material ability to be able to put gestures onto paper without thinking. And the reason that we put gestures onto paper without thinking is because we've attained a certain mastery of working with pen to paper, where we could actually forget it. It's like driving. You know, at a certain point when you're learning how to drive, it's like, okay, this goes this, and this goes here. At a certain point, the driving becomes second nature, where you don't question each and every step. That's that mastery. And it's a part of the formula which can't be left out of it. So my most profound moments in my studios, which are really quite moving, is where I'll take the entire 3 hours and I'll just take the most arrogant student's drawing board, and I'll just put up a sheet of paper and I'll just start to draw and behave like a jackass, because that's what I do in the studio. But that's all I do. And there's no requirement that they sit around me. It's just I draw, and it's even my presence. And it actually has a huge, profound impact, because then they see how I end a line. Then they see how I draw something or how I invent something. And that emulation gives them at least the ability to have a hint of the process and how much time it actually takes to be able to do that kind of thing.
So for emulation, that's an important part, but I don't think it can't be the only part. It's like you have to first understand before you know how to before you can critique it and be a critical thinker of it.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that becomes challenging, especially partially in the maker movement, is there's all this stuff on YouTube, and it almost is like have a book on the table. Yeah, so that's it. That's how you do it. You want to make a mold? You use fiberglass, you make a mold. This is how you do it. Follow this 1 step by 2, 1, 2, 3, got it.
Yeah.
And then it's like, wait a second. Is that really right? Does that mean I have to make a mold with this stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is there other things I can do with it?
Mm-hmm.
And so the importance, especially for the education of a reflective practitioner, is to constantly question and reframe what you're looking at. And because once it becomes fixed, it's fixed.
Mm-hmm.
That's no longer design. Now it's manipulation. And sometimes we do have to fix it. It's not like we can't change everything. But we have to know when we're critically altering something to contribute to some kind of intellectual discourse. And so there's this play between, yes, maybe we do have to emulate first in order to understand what that baseline is.
I don't think it's first. I think it's simultaneous. But I think it's
emulation and process, maybe, right?
Yeah.
It has to have some sort of generative, origin in the process after that. Like
You see-
emulation culture is taking architectural representation, by the neck right now, where you look at an image, students reproduce, but they don't know that what they're looking at, yes, it's abstraction, but abstraction as a concept is super wrought with many implications, and abstraction is totally misinterpreted today, where students think that abstraction is not putting information, whereas another interpretation would be abstraction is distilling things to its essence, and only its essence.
We see that part of the process of doing the actual drawing in front of the students is not so much, to show my wonderful skills at working in hand. It's actually about how I make the decisions. That's where it becomes the most interesting, because I'll draw something and I'll start to do something to it, and there will be panic which will ensue. They'll go, "Why did you do that?" And I'll just go, "I don't know." I said, "No, but seriously, why did you draw that window?" "I don't know. I just don't know." And for them to see how that decision, how these intuitive doodle decisions throw themselves onto a page is one thing. Because we tell them to do that all the time. Just do something here. But the process is I go through this internal dialogue of questioning, but also building on it and making it into something and having it actually emerge. So they actually start to see that, oh, okay, as long as you actually start to transform it, transcend it, and turn it into something, then it could actually become part of the process.
I think part of it is about being, about needing to be immediate. And I think this idea that things are immediate is also related to the idea of sort of the ancient art of sculpture. I hit this block of wood with a chisel and that chip flies away. That's immediate. I'm working with that medium immediately. We work all the time with devices where we treat them as platforms for virtual experiences, but the electrons are material. The liquid crystal is material. The phone is material. It is material. So it's happening, there are things happening that are invisible to us. The same way, what happened to the tree over the 150 years is invisible to us.
Yeah.
And that's part of what's not understood. I have a friend who has a PhD in wood biology, and he made it clear to me how much is actually going around that piece of wood, which appears to be, in the moment, just a static thing in front of me. So part of that sort of deeper knowledge, beyond superficial knowledge, comes from that kind of understanding. You mentioned is it canoes there building? Near here, there's one of the oldest businesses in America, which is the boat shop, Lola's Boat Shop in Amesbury. And I was taking my son to school, if you wanted to call it that. I guess it was pretty radical. But going by that one morning, and I pointed it out, and I said, they build boats in that building. And he said, how do they know how to build a boat? And that's a kind of a staggering question. You know, you have another 10 minutes to explain that. So it made quite evident the vast amount of experience over many, many, many centuries and millennia by which those things that they do in that traditional boat building shop are what they are, which are patterns and things that have developed over time. But part of the exercise, it was important because part of the exercise of these students was to actually build a boat in that boat shop at the age, 5th grade and so forth and so on. So the materiality of it was evident, not only in form of the handling of the tools, but the resistance of the material itself. And I think sometimes we treat design as an activity with no resistance.
Exactly.
And there's an incredible amount of resistance to it, having practiced design for a long time. There's an incredible conceptual resistance as well. So the cultural knowledge, social knowledge that's required, historical knowledge required to practice design is pretty extensive and almost infinite.
I'll give you a couple of anecdotes to pick up on that. One, I was lucky enough to visit the America's Cup last year when they were just finishing the Oracle racing boat. And I asked a question I always ask of teams like that. It's like, who was the architect? Who conceived this? And for the first time, I think I got back the answer I've been waiting for since 1985, which was, there wasn't one. There wasn't one. There was below the water was a hydro engineer, above it was aero, there was a mechanical engineer, there was a structural engineer, there was the fabricator and the client's budget, and it went round on a sort of series of plastic models where the expertise of each was being negotiated, if you will. So that boat emerged from a communal activity of very sophisticated creativity and ended up foiling upwind. I mean, it broke the mold of millennia of boat building. To your point, when I went to an architecture school where we were day one given a problem and just told fuck off and do it. We're not going to teach you how to design, just go and do it. And we're all like, what do we do? You've got to design a house for yourself. You've got 3 weeks, come back. And it was an experiment in architectural pedagogy, I think, that you were just in at the deep end immediately with no instruction. And I found that sort of thrilling. I guess I've been attracted to people whose design process differs from the norm. And I found myself, when I started teaching at the Architectural Association, going and visiting William Forsythe's Frankfurt Ballet. And Bill Forsythe I've gotten to know quite well. And we went and witnessed the creation of one of his ballets behind the scenes. And there's a wonderful documentary that was being filmed at that time. And I remember the scene where Bill and there's a young German intern, and the intern is trying to emulate him. So Bill is in the rehearsal studio, and Bill's like, "What the hell are you doing?" And the kid's sort of like, "Well, I'm doing what you're doing, maestro," kind of thing. He says, no, you cannot copy this. How would you copy this? He says, "Let me explain." And he takes him through the internal algorithms of his kids' heads, and he's putting his heart through the height of his kids' heads, and he's essentially saying, you have to have your own story. And then you'll be part of this collective, which is a collective of rule-based generative design. So this is autopoiesis. I'm not the choreographer who tells you what to do any longer. I'm giving a set of rules, and each of you has to play through those rules. And it's an amazing sort of confrontation. And I think increasingly I've been fascinated to put my finger on the emergence of what I call autopoiesis. So it's a creativity, but it's augmented by a variety of algorithms, machines, devices, what have you. And you would think, as we enter into a sort of man-machine symbiosis with computation, that augmented ability to generate things would be coming to the fore, and I think it is. I think in many ways it is. We're just not quite putting our finger on it. And it has a history. I'd say Raymond Roussell's literature, late 19th century, which is an automatically generated text. Antoni Gaudi's extraordinary plastic invention at that same period, coming through to mid-century with someone like James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, that consolidates and makes the center of the canon. And I track it all the way through to people like Bill Forsyth now, who are now the dominant, creative practitioners, if you will. So it's gone from being marginal and booed off stage in 1880 to now becoming actually the coolest shit around. And I'd say Tom Main has done that in architecture. If you look at Tom Main's process, he gets very disturbed if anyone designs. He's like, "Oh, what are you doing?" There's a system, there's a logic, and they spend enormous amounts of time putting a logic into play. And all of these people, if you talk to them, they're seeking to exceed their own creative ability. They're seeking, they're more intense works, they're more sophisticated works, they're more original works, they're orchestrated chaos works, whatever. They're trying to exceed what you can do through the sort of hand-eye logic. And I applaud them because I think that there is this, there's an extraordinary capacity that's available to us if we surrender our determinacy. So this is what I take. I find Ranulph's articulation of doodling as a release of creativity. Yes, we all do that, but if I find myself doing that, I am so bored because I know what I can doodle. I really am. And I seek intellectual armatures that will exceed my ability and surprise me, and I find that far more interesting. And I think as a general cultural tendency, those works which are seen to be sort of pioneering and thrilling in the present are almost all engaging that new man-machine aptitude, which doesn't mean you're using a computer. It means that you're looking for other ways of creating. And you see it in music, you see it in dance, you see it in architecture, you see it everywhere. And I do think that's the tendency that's emerging. And when you see Tom Main as one of the most successful commercial architects in America, it means it's here already. It really means and it will soon become the norm, in my opinion.
But just to comment also on Tom Main and the doodle. So first off, I don't think when Randolph talks about the pen and paper and the doodle, he doesn't mean that it's the pen that's so important. It could be anything. It could be the dialogue machine. It could be dialogue. For me, it's with mathematics. I sketch with math. They're super precise, but they're open for lots of interpretation. They're not. And similar with the doodle, what I like what Randolph says is it's purposeless initially. Tom Main especially makes a lot of things where he doesn't design for anything but the sake of just designing. So if you were to go in Tom Main's studio, you'd find these giant models on the wall that are basically sculptural artifacts, but what they really are objects to think with. For whatever reason, there's a curiosity there. He hangs it on the wall, he digests it, and somehow at some point he will distill an idea from that and actually architecturalize it with some consequences for a building. But he does lots of that stuff where it's not today I'm going to draw a plan of a house or something. No, I'm just curious about this. I'm curious about booleans and holes. Let's see what happens when I do holes. Well, that one just looks like another hole. Actually, if I put a bunch of them really close together, oh, now it looks jittery. I like jittery. I don't know what jittery is, but I think I'm going to do more, and I'm making up that dialogue. It's not necessarily Tom Main, but it becomes this kind of reflective feedback loop. And of course, imagine his colleagues in the studio also a part of that. But it's really just about generating ideas and new ways of finding the unpredictable. And then later, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but on the flip side of that, he started out with Sixth Street drawings, which were architectural distillations of elements, and he put those on a page and said that the elements in their new configuration are not architecture, but they are architectural elements. There'd be a beam, there'd be a window, and they were kind of looked like they were put in a blender and put on. And there's no kind of organization to how those were laid on top. He uses tools like superimposition. So on the one hand, you're talking about how he doesn't go and he doesn't say this is a window or this is a door, this is it. But he started out with just the opposite, and he distilled House 6 to the 11 or something objects that he used to construct it. And then he said, now it's a composition, but not in a house form. So there's a real kind of play between
these ways of working from the sketch, and if I interpret it in a very traditional way, what Randolph was talking about, the doodle, to other kinds of forms that you were talking about, are based on the fact that human cognitive capacity is not very good. And so we've been finding ways to transcend our own limitations. For me, this is what's great about conversation. I have a lot of limitations. I mean, I'm struck more now of how limited I actually am than how much capacity I have. And I recognize that there are techniques and there are people and there are strategies of bringing in a lot more to do things that I'd like to do than I have myself. I can't keep a lot of things in mind if I'm visualizing something. But if I put it on paper, I can see it. I get the relationships I wanted, and I get all the other relationships that are not logical constructions, but perceptual constructions. So I look and I go, oh, look at all that. Now I can work with that. And I think that's what's interesting about the sketch, or the idea of the sketch, is we find ways in which we transcend our limitations.
But you see, I'm totally fascinated with some of the assumptions that are being made. But Raymond Roussel, and again, I'm a very big fan of Raymond Roussel. It's the stories about how we went about creating some of these texts are as entertaining, to the point where he actually wrote a book on how I wrote some of my books. But the key to Raymond Roussel is that it's this cacophony of surrealist and unpredictable elements which are collided together. But it's in his tissage, how he actually starts to connect everything together, the word craft of being able to connect it into something that is cohesive. That is a technique that has taken him years to do. So Raymond Roussel could not just be somebody who throws these crazy ideas out onto the page. It's really about writing. And it's just like Tom Main. I don't know his work as well as I should, but what I do know about it is that the details are profoundly amazing. I mean, they are really worked details. And usually, if I see any of his buildings, there's usually a WTF that follows when I'm looking at it closely. And that comes with this ability to have technique, because the collage building or the collage text is something inevitably a first-year student will always do. And they'll go, see, I did it. What did I do? And the question is, well, how does that come back together? How do you make those connections? How do you use the word craft to make it into something that's really valuable? So for me, it comes back down to the materiality and that very long process of really understanding and getting acclimatized and gaining mastery of your medium, where it actually starts to take hold. Because building collages are a dime a dozen. You go into any architecture school and you just make a call for all the building collages, you'll end up with maybe 100, 200 per semester. but where it actually comes together is not the collage. And the objective is that it becomes its own authentic piece of work too. That's the other point I wanted to make, is that these tactics are not just a search for exceeding your own expectations of your creativity, because I agree with that too. But they're also about making something which is truly authentic. And that's really difficult. And that goes all the way back to painting and the origins of painting, where you would be working with the same quote-unquote concept or conceptual idea, but it's a skill in which you start to interpret that and put that together with your technique where it actually starts to count.
There's Venice, and then there's this book I saw yesterday called Elements of Venice. Catalogs all of the elements of Venice, and you just reminded me of that, a description of it. Yeah, Hisari, which is a fascinating compendium of all the elements that they could discover about Venice. But then there's the Venice we all know, which is not this assemblage of a catalog of elements, but something that grew organically over time, over a long period of time. Going back to the thought of sketching, what are you sketching? What are you doing with this thing or the material when you sketch? In a way, it has nothing to do with what you're thinking about, because you're probably thinking about something that doesn't relate to the sketch at all. It's almost an automatic activity, kind of like chewing gum, I guess, for business majors. But the thing about the sketching is that the accumulation of or coincidence of an item that you might have created with a sketch and your long-term memory of those things is best described, I think, by G. Spencer Brown in his appendix to Laws of Form, where he talks about the idea of bearing in mind. Not being busy, not thinking, not working, not doing, nothing, but simply bearing in mind. He's very explicit about that, and it follows a paragraph where he talks about being neither proud nor ashamed of your ignorance, which I find to be a really powerful phrase. So this idea of bearing in mind, I think, also has to do with the sort of lack of immediacy of this process of designing, that this accumulation over moments and years produces some kind of capacity to notice something and see an opportunity in it to resolve something that maybe has been plaguing you for a long time. And it could be 30 years. I have a 20-year metric on many things that I've worked with, where it's almost frightening, the number of things where when it came to mind, took about 20 years to become publicly, acceptable to talk about it. So duration is a big deal in all of this activity.
The sketch is a wonderful thing. It's a magical moment and whatever. It's a very small part of design. And so, there is this sort of non-directed, looking for the picnic spot business. And then there's also the other stuff, And I think that Randolph was always an advocate of neither this nor that, but a kind of open understanding of the possibilities. And so there's also lots of other stuff. When you draw the window, why did you put it there? I don't know. Really, I can't articulate the reason right now. Are there no reasons? Well, see, the beginning student might go, well, he just puts the window wherever he feels like putting it. Yes, but that putting is driven by an intuition which has got several years, maybe more than 5, that's been put into it. And so, how do we structure an understanding that has enough basis to feed the intuition? The dancer needs all that stuff. So Forsyth's got his thing that he does, but that's based on a deep experience of his life and his interests and the things that are important. It's just not something that he came up with. So, I think that there's some depth there that we have to think about.
Can also emulate someone doing Tai Chi But unless you understand what's actually going on behind what you can't, understand what you can't see, you're just going to be waving your arms.
I was thinking about that when you started to talk about the way that you designed in your conversation with your partner, and then Mark, you also mentioned your conversation. These are all kind of based off of historical, or a couple years of conversations. And when I started to think about how I design, and since I have such a young studio, the people that I'm mainly communicating, it's one or two clients, or it's a prompt from a competition. And it's up to me to really interrogate exactly what the prompt's asking and really get to know that client. And oftentimes, it's about interpreting what's not said, right? It's, the client wants X, Y, Z, but I say, okay, why? Why? And I'm like, oh, it's because you need a place to put your shoes next to your bed at night. It's something really simple like that becomes, oh, okay, that's a solution, right? So it's a lot about getting to know and understanding, even with the student, sitting down with them, they want this, they want that, they want it to look a certain way, but it's like, oh, okay, but this is the path that you can go down, but you're not saying that, but I have to kind of interpret. It's a lot about what's not being said, which I think is a really kind of fun and exciting opportunity to recognize what's not there.
Is it useful to go back and remind ourselves of the term design? I mean, it emerged in the Renaissance designo as a term given to give equal legitimacy, cultural legitimacy, as music and the arts to the engagement with graphic projection, and it came on the back of two new apparati, mapping and perspective. Now, it's astonishing to think that prior to the Renaissance, we didn't draw to produce buildings. And there's a great historian at MIT who laments the fall of plastic and spatial imagination from the Gothic to the Renaissance. So there's no guarantee that with a technical armature-like perspective, you get an enhanced imagination. Maybe you actually get a curtailed imagination. He thinks it was deplorable. We started working with squares and circles, whereas we had been able to work with little sort of proto-design sketches, sort of a schemata that went into the logics of the Gothic. So when you mentioned Venice, I was sort of thinking it becomes a catalogue of parts instead of a spatial continuity of complexity. And so, design had that, and it took about 100 years for people to play with perspective. Really took a long time for them to assimilate what the hell is this thing. Everyone was fascinated by it, because you could draw the real. It was really thrilling. And so many people engaged it, but they didn't really find a good use for it. It was so complex. And eventually what emerges is architects, in setting up perspectives, you have to do plans and sections. That's part of the thing. And it was the learning of that technique that seems to then have allowed architects like Raphael to start saying, hey, this is useful. We can draw three-dimensional objects in plan and section. And that became the intellectual habitude. And then the schools are set up to train that difficult thing of taking two-dimensional projections into three dimensions. So that's the emergence of Disegno. And what came almost immediately was a whole city planning from the sky. So mapping and perspective sort of come into play, and you get these ideal town plans, Fort Cinder and other things, boom, 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 which had never been conceived of in the Gothic. So partly liberating, partly not, but that act of projective imagination based on a technical armature is the history of design, right? Mm-hmm. Sketching is something else. So sketching is sort of noodling around with a graphic propensity, but our tradition, the term design comes from that. And it certainly was then, I think, breached sort of, again, late 19th century and into the avant-garde schools with the concussive new apparati of photography, film, phonography, and so then the experimental schools started saying, how the hell do we work now? And collage, montage, and things became the devices by which you could engage that new capacity of sort of technical mental aptitude. And so you get these juxtapositions of things, and constructivism is not that which you can draw, it's that which you can sort of collage together, and this thing comes out, it's a series of fragments. So kind of fascinating. So then what's happening currently as we embrace computation, probably take us 100 years of floundering around. We're 50 years in, and it seems to me we're still largely mimicking what we have done. We're not really thinking through what is the new capacity for, it's a new mnemonic relationship, and we're fishing for what it might be. And so I'm very drawn to those sort of rule-based generative practices. And I'd say at the heart of computation, if you talk to the silicon chip designers, oh my God, I mean, so the silicon chips went from 10 million transistors in the late 80s to 1 million. At that point, they could no longer design them by hand. So then they had to create algorithms and compute them. And they've now gone up, and routinely a silicon chip will have about 15 billion transistors, which are all organized and controlled through prescription, and they'll generate 100 million a night. So there you have the silicon chip architects, and if you talk with them, they're very proud that they are they impose the logic on a rule-based generative system, and then they witness the assimilation. So behind all of our kindled imagination is a design activity which is already off to the races. Massive computation that subtends your billion transistors in your iPhone and 27 miles of copper wire and a thing the size of your thumbnail. So it's those processes I find really fascinating in the present, and where I get that the kind of noodling of ideas or something is suggested, but I find it quite quaint. I do. I mean, I read through these things, and I say, well, that's how, when I was a student, I designed with a pencil. But is that where aspirational intellect is going to be? And I'm kind of like, no, I'm sorry. So
let me. I want to touch back on the perspective, because I think that's a really interesting time in history, where it's said that it was done by an architect, but it probably was a collection of architects working on that problem. But still, it is a perfect example of what we would call design research, which Reinhold says scientific research is a subset of design, and it's not the other way around.
The term design wasn't in existence.
But no. But hear me out for a second. And if you look at what was done there, it was not they designed an image or they're designing a thing. They're using design, or what we call second order cybernetics, whatever you want to call that action, as a way to create knowledge. Mm-hmm. That was a new knowledge base. It was a new process. It was a new methodology for creating the illusion of depth and space in a very precise way. And it didn't just influence architects, it influenced all the disciplines. This is before Charles Darwin. And if you know, even Charles Darwin, what was the main communicative device for that? Observation and recording. And then using some of those techniques as well. So at that moment, the design methodology was starting to advance all the other disciplines. And so I think for me the distinction with second order cybernetics and when it's used with design is when it's not just designing a thing, we're using it to create knowledge. And I know, like for myself, you know my background with math. I'm not a mathematician. I played with math, but then I observed it very precisely. And at some point it's like, hey, if you place a function inside of a function of sine, it actually flattens the shape. And if I keep doing that recursively, it flattens it more. I got to write that down. Flattening. But you start to create your own framework, which maybe was missed. A mathematician will look at it and say, 1800s, what are you doing? We're so past that. It's like, you know how to do this? Well, that's trivial. Why would we care about that? So the idea that, it's not that even if they say the most cutting edge thing is here, or the chip, that doesn't necessarily, I'm skeptical of that. It might be, but there might also be something back here that we kind of missed, that we got to look at again and then bring it back. But I think the point is, how do we create knowledge? And then when we share it...
These terms we used the idea earlier, knowledge, research, these are all from a hermeneutic canon. They're all analytical reason, that those terms are from that. I think we're moving from hermeneutics to heuretics, and heuretics is inventive intellect. Inventive intellect doesn't seek knowledge, doesn't seek analysis. It seeks fulfillment.
Fulfillment meaning action?
Well, I don't know, but it's Kant's call. It's the creative component that gets augmented into analytical reason. So it's a projective imagination. Perhaps there's an acquisition of knowledge, but I don't think it's the goal of it. The goal of it is engagement, fulfillment, and So
creates the
creativity.
gap, or creates a vacuum in some sense that needs to be filled. But I think I'm interested in the idea that projection and perspective and mapping are the sort of iron gate within which we've been held captive, and still exists as the platform for trying to build cities for 12 billion people on this particular planet. And I don't think the squares and right angles are going to work. So, I mean, now that's a preposterous thing to say. We say that in the comfort of a studio. We never say that in public, because then I have to fact check it. So, Paul will know I'm about to launch into distinction between numeric control and record playback. You just recorded, you said about the recording of something, and record playback is an amazing thing when you consider the plasticity and the elasticity that's required to deal with living and breathing in between the binary. And once you move out of the binary, you're into waveforms. You're away from this kind of static concept, or you get away immediately from the idea of planning. And you suddenly realize that the people with spreadsheets and clipboards are the crazy fantasists, and the people actually just chopping away at a piece of wood are realists. And they don't know where they're headed.
Could I jump in to comment on
Absolutely.
You have to.
what Joe was about saying? And riffs on it. I worry a little bit about too much emphasis of second order being about knowledge in the sense of acquisition of knowledge. A distinction between science and second order cybernetics has been made, which is science is about acquiring knowledge, and second order cybernetics is about action. Indeed, performative ontology would be Andy Pickering's very heavy phrase. But he does mean a forward projection toward action. So I think of second order cybernetics as enabling action rather than just knowledge. Now there may be knowledge in between, but the action is where you learn. And as Heinz Forster would say, if you wish to see, learn how to act. And so I don't want to stop at knowledge, and I just wanted to sort of combine what I think your intentions are, which are all correct.
And Todd Oldham would say, if you want to understand design, make a shirt.
Beautiful. Perfect, exactly.
So,
What I think
there's
is
that.
interesting about the perspective is that it was first developed as a description, right? Alberti described how to make a perspective. There was no kind of, here's a line and then you do this and that. But before you actually describe how to construct a perspective drawing, you have to have the capacity to imagine the plan and imagine a section, because these things in reality don't actually exist. You cannot literally take a slice through a building and say, oh, this is where the shapes are, the forms are, and you cannot really experience a plan of something in its totality. So it already presupposes the ability to imagine in the head. And then now there's a move with parametric modeling where we can design cities through our computer that don't really require that foresight of imagining, because you're designing forms as the movement rather than a line and process. So when it comes back to your comment about having a knowledge outcome, it was foremost a process to get to a perspective, which was that knowledge outcome, right? So I'm just trying to kind of lay bare that in that process of building a perspective, it was never a visual cue. It was a verbal one. So it already requires an education almost to construct what is so common to us today. We know lines converge to one point, and we know that. We know how to kind of map it ourselves.
All of the creative people who seem to be doing rule-based generative work, all the ones I've engaged, it's not casual at all, and it never can be said. The Tom Main project, probably not many of you are architects, but so he's Pritzker Prize winning, Golden Boy of American Architecture, building Chinese cities now. He's getting some enormous projects. And I think from the outset of his early work, he was fidgeting with what are the rules that subtend what I'm doing. So he does these crazy graphics. And finally, I met him about 10 years ago at one of the Venice Biennales and said, I'm very interested in your work as exemplary of parametrics. And he says, oh, I can't turn on the machine, don't look at me. And I said, no. you're generating by rules behind the scenes. I can see you're not designing any longer, you're generating these things, right? And he was like, how do you know? He looked a bit startled. And he said, we've just got a big grant, and so I'm putting that into the generation of what he calls drawdles, so that it's a series of three-dimensional complex. Well, actually, they're two-dimensional drawings that get turned into three-dimensional, and they're completely abstract. That seemingly so, but they start from point, line, plane. They adopt rotation, reflection. So these are within the canon of architectural history. So he's manipulating them through a series of computational processes, but not expertly, but certainly with absolute discipline. I mean, so it's within. And then he's as you say, he puts them around the office. So this went on through the recession. He spent probably $200,000 more paying people to do these. He had a team of 6 people for 3 years work on them. And he's casually put them around the office. In fact, what's now happening, he sent me a couple of presentations. When they get asked to design a Chinese city in 2 weeks, he says, if you want complexity and contradiction in your cities, you can't sit and design it. You don't have time. You have to have already worked at that complexity. And so they're now using these drawdles as templates to lift cities through them. I was like, oh my God. That is just not what we're taught in architecture school. What an incredible intellectual project. So he has a series of about 30 of these things, and he combines them. He's become very familiar with them. They're highly complex, nuanced things. Mm-hmm. And his skill is now being able to see the program of a whole university and lift it through this drawdle. And it just left me absolutely stunned and thrilled that there was this experiment going on. And you look at his work, and it's like, how the hell did he do that? It's the same when I look at Bill Forsyth. It's because there's a very disciplined, long-term engagement with how do we get greater sort of richness, complexity into our things, and we can. It's an intellectual project. But that's not by drawing. If he catches people in the office composing, he's like, no.
Does he see these as does he see himself as building cities or laboratories in which to understand how people can live together at that density? Because in some sense, these are experiments,
They are experiments.
right, with human lives. And if they're tensile strength centric, they might not be psychological strength or emotive strength centric. So I wonder to what extent that practice might be informed by the idea that you need a laboratory bigger than the experiment to do certain kinds of experiments. And what we're facing right now are experiments that need to be done urgently around how people will live at those densities in cities.
Without an institutional review board.
Yeah, and well, without the New York Times helping us get through life by saying, here are 10 ways to cook zucchini this summer, and by the way, here's where a nuclear weapon could land tomorrow. It's sort of, okay, the new norm is let's build bigger cities because we apparently need them, but let's not question what actually happens in them. And that's where I think we need to escape from parametric design around materiality of cities and just completely invent a new public etiquette.
Well, look, coming from a region which is experiencing the opposite problem is how to deal with the transforming client, but also the transformation of infrastructure from highly populated areas to lowly populated areas, and how do you actually compete with these large urban centers? In my mind, I keep on running into a lot of parametricization, but also a lot of theoretical work, which is grounded in this assumption that the cities will grow massively and will be highly dense. And that's true to a certain extent, but it's not addressing a large part of the world and a large part of what exists.
Doesn't need to be our future.
It doesn't need to, but I think more importantly is it's almost as if the assumption is that these cities are going to be permanently dense. We're almost taking the dense city as an object, as a static object, and saying we're going to design for that. What we actually do need to design for is change, as opposed to anything else. Because one thing that is going on, I totally agree that there's change, but I don't think we're going to have change for 20, 30 years and things are going to calm down. We're going to be able to retire I actually think that change and rapid change is something that is going to be long-standing and permanent within our culture because we communicate at a much faster rate. We invent, or I would say we synthesize at a much faster rate. So you can't just design for sustainability, you actually have to design for climate change. How can these buildings be adapted to whatever is coming our way in the next 30 years? But 30 years after that, how can they adapt as well? So it's really trying to have a different understanding of what the problematic is, that it's a temporal one, rather than just, from one state to the next. And these are energetic states. This is where Simondon talks about information that really is in the phase changes of things, that we really have to be concentrating and shifting the whole point of design, that it's within these phase changes that really we're going to be making our world.
So it'll be somewhere between solid and liquid, more in the form of plasma, that we might
Well,
think about these.
how do we modulate our world, and how do we modulate our world, and what comes out is physical evidence. Bricks are the result of a modulation out of a containment, and out of a containment where phase change coagulates into a particular shape. We assume that the brick is the unit, but the actual brick itself is in that process of that actual change. But that is actually how early brick makers, before the word design came around, perceived what the brick was. It was an object that just happened to have a shape which was just big enough for the hand. So we need to make this paradigm shift to designing for something which is actively in change right now.
Well, one way of phrasing that back to Ranoff is Ranoff talks also about the unmanageable and the manageable, and when something maybe should be unmanageable. Maybe it's better if it's unmanageable. And it's kind of like, for a city, do you really design the whole city? I don't know about that. But maybe you design some rules and logic and things that can adapt. So you design a system. And so it's really, and then at that point, you let a certain level of unmanageability take over. You make it so it is set up to be adapted and transformed, but yet you're setting up certain constraints so it can operate and live. And I don't know, I'm speculating with this, but it's...
No, but
then
I
you
think
get
that-
into the area of governance,
Yeah, exactly.
regulation, and management
Exactly.
is a corporate term for how that's accomplished, typically with command and control, and many pyramids. Governance becomes another issue, and you challenge the idea. Someone brought something up earlier about, suggested to me that sort of even challenging the idea of a nation state when you have that much fluidity in the population migration. We think refugee movement and immigration is somehow happening at a different rate than it was in the past. It may have even slowed down, but it will certainly increase as this situation becomes more dynamic. And that will challenge ideas of governance. It'll challenge ideas of democracy, which are currently being challenged with this sort of moving to fascism light in certain areas, where that's the only tenable solution for getting water and sewage and food to people in quantities on this planet.
I think that's a really, really important point, because let's just go back to this question of designing for the density. And just a very small anecdote, a sliver of about 2 weeks, in the space of 2 weeks, a tweet went out to the Haitian community in the U.S., and mostly in Florida, that their immigration papers were no longer going to be valid or something like that, but they were welcome to go to Canada, to Montreal, with a fairly large community. This rapidly just spread everywhere among the Haitian community in the United States, which is massive, really massive. Now I'm facing a 1 hour border wait. Why? Because there's busloads of these refugees, which are basically going across the border, around Rouse's Point, a very small road, and the RCMP officer says, "I'm going to have to arrest you." And then what's happened is that they've been totally overwhelmed in all of the places that usually welcome refugees in the Montreal area. So then now they've been moved to the Olympic Stadium, and the Olympic Stadium is starting to get populated and get densified with all these cots that these refugees are staying at. They're all reasonably well-to-do. They're not like coming. They're just like more like economic refugees more than anything else. And then 2 protests the last weekend, one which was anti-refugee, another one which was pro-refugee. This happened in a week and a half. A week and a half. I mean, a complete transformation, and that's what I mean. That it's not a question of just, by 2000, by 2035, the city is going to get to this area. We actually have to be prepared for very dynamic shifts in everything, and it comes down to that issue. It comes down to that issue of governance. We're going to have to live with favelas. But, favelas are just ways that people exist. So how do we actually engage those problems so that that transformation can actually be more reasonable? Well, you can't have a big government overseeing it. You have to change how things are policed. You have to change how things are governed. And I think it's a much more global issue.
Well, especially if you're subject to cybernetics, you're somewhat interested in governance and regulation of systems and systems of systems. And so I think this is an area where cybernetics probably could take the forefront and take the leading arguments in how to deal with some of these situations.
Which they did when
Yeah.
Maturana and Varela, that whole environment in pre-Pinochet Chile,
Yeah.
which they were actually involved in that. So.
Yeah, I like the idea that refugees end up in a stadium, that we could eventually end up with immigration being a sport, okay, at the level of the FIFA, and everyone get involved.
So talking about sports, I think it's time we start to engage our athletes over there on the wall and start to
Oh, dear.
shift gears where we went through a lot.
Oh, dear.
So we have, I think it's
Can we
time-
get up and walk over?
Absolutely. And I think this is a lot to digest. So, but yeah, that looks about right.
Yeah.
Well done.
So where do we start?
So there's a chronology to this.
Left to right, more or less.
Seminar 23 by Jacques Lacan, he analyzes James Joyce, which is a phenomenal thing to try to do, but one great man looking at another great mind. And he spends hours before his lectures at the blackboard trying to draw, and he chooses a figure. So his model of psychic normalcy, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, of interlaced Borromean knot, and he proposes a fourth ring. In Joyce's case, he says the imaginary has come unhinged, and therefore he sutures himself back together with his creativity. That's a fourth ring. And so he called this the symptom, the symptom. And he would try to draw that symptom. And he chose it as a figure that was deliberately beyond the imaginary. So everyone listening to this very elusive conversation about the motivational psychology of James Joyce was forced to project themselves into a space that was kind of almost unknowable. It was very, very complex. I've had my students try to do the synthoem as a parametric exercise. It's actually quite easy. It's not quite easy, it's difficult, but almost to make the point that we're already at a different technical threshold. That's no longer beyond the imaginary, it's actually quite manageable. And then I pose the question, so what would beyond the imaginable be now? And it's a very interesting exercise.
So we just elected that.
Yeah. And so I looked at this and I was just thinking of Jacques Lacan trying to draw what is beyond the imaginary.
Yeah, the unmanageable, the unimaginable.
There's an interesting dialogue with Derrida where they analyze the Purloined Letter.
Yeah.
And what comes from that is there's a huge dialogue between other and the other's other. So this kind of, for me, represents our conversations, but our conversations inverse or other, like a physical representation of it through drawing, which is fundamentally architectural in school.
Can you two shed some, I'm not familiar with this. Can you shed some insight into your reflection and action, or your constructed reality of what we were just doing, the code version? Just, you don't have to have everything, but just a little bit. Where you're going through.
Well, it definitely goes from left to right in this sort of timeline. But you can see, like, once they got to the end, and the draw errors and things from the beginning, which I thought was really interesting, how it kind of looped around in that way. It became almost like a circuit. For me, I just listened for icons, like words that I could instantly think of. And sometimes they weren't like how you use them. Like there's a bear over there, you sit there and run, and it's part of the bear, and you're that. So I don't know. I think it's kind of a spark interpretation in a way.
That
It's
sounds really
always-
Canadian. Bear in mind, and, yeah, that.
Also, like towards the end, we started running out of space. Some of the things you would say like reminded me of stuff that we had already drawn. So instead of drawing it again, I just go back and like reflect on and add to what we'd already put up there. Even if the original thought behind the original drawing wasn't what you're talking about, that new moment. Like if there was some sort of tie, you just like wrap it all up.
Did a project with a PhD student in which we had access to the studio at MPAC, which is just huge. Okay. And we were able to do experiments that nobody else in conceptual psychology could ever do because we had a different laboratory. And it's interesting what that limitation might do to the science that we could do. In this case, something different happened when you reached the end of the paper, which is really interesting. What would happen at the end of it here? You know, within that process. Well, we don't know that. We don't know that in advance. But this idea that because of that limitation, all of a sudden you're back over here, places that you wouldn't be if the paper had gone to the end of the wall. You never get to that thing. So it's really, I think this is interesting. Forced to do something different because of this interesting limitation.
I'm interested in the decision to fill in the white space, because in architecture and composition making, there's like a applied use of white space. I wonder if it was a conscious effort to make it seem like more, to put more in there, or if it just brought everything more cohesively together. Like, what were your ambitions between the vertical lines that fill in the spaces between the objects?
It's more to bring it all together.
Yeah. Can you say more about it? Did you mutually agree on it? Did you say, like, let's bring it together in one, and okay, yeah, vertical lines?
Or did you emulate?
I think it just kind of happened. I don't, we didn't talk about it now.
Huh.
So the arrows are the ones that beg to be defined and explained, sort of what Tim Berners-Lee calls link type. What does that connection mean? Not what are those two things, but what is the connection between those two things mean? And the arrows going one way are different kinds of symbols than an arrowhead going both ways, whether reflexive or directional.
I don't think you should read that as a critique of your drawing. I mean, you might say, well, grab a pen and label them. We were busy. You know, I mean, this is. I think you guys worked really hard trying to keep up with stuff that was pretty wacky. I think you did a fabulous job. I have no problems with it. But I think that it's bringing things back, you know, to us in a way that we wouldn't have in our memories. You're almost like an external memory, and you put this stuff up here. And when I come back and look at this, I remember it in a different way than I would remember it if I put myself back. It's very.
I think one question would be the extent to which these images or signs become what people remember 30 days from now, as opposed to something you might have said. Because of the power of that.
This is more interesting than anything I said. So why not?
One thing I'd like to do is engage you all now, because you were here hearing us talk, listening to us talk, and seeing them do that. And yeah, I'd like to, please.
Well, I want to thank the panel. I found this very, very useful exercise in at least two ways. I knew Ralph for quite a number of years. I heard him speak on numerous occasions. And frankly, I didn't get it. I found much of what he did puzzling. And although it was interesting and thought-provoking, I didn't understand where he was going with it. And now I think I
Daisy Ames.
You mentioned about perspective drawing, almost first imagining it in the head. And one of the things that second-order cyberneticians spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about is why don't other people get it? We have physicists and neurobiologists and economists and psychologists and educators, and in their presentations, they almost always express frustration that their colleagues don't seem to understand what they're doing. And now I think I've come to somewhat more understanding as a result of your comments, and that is that second-order cybernetics requires imagining the process of knowledge creation. That is, most people just focus on the knowledge, but they don't have a description of the knowledge creation process. And that, in a sense, is what second-order cybernetics is about.
I piggyback on that. So this is super interesting and is orienting me towards the way in which sort of how minds hold minds and minds are sort of epistemic engines to create new forms of knowledge and thus different kinds of technologies. I was very curious if you guys would be willing to say something about when you're holding your own mind in mind, what kind of voice are you using when you make those kinds of corrections to design or architecture and so on and so forth, which seems to be the mechanism by which autopoietic system, well, the autopoietic analogy in this context self-organizes in a rule-based fashion, that the moderating variable is the way people talk to themselves internally, the way people imagine an image of something before it's created. And just to make it more concrete, like my 2-year-old niece, when she's learning how to speak, and she's trying to say a complicated word like spaghetti, and mispronounces it like spaghetti, and then says, no. And then there's something happening internally where she's speaking to herself. There's some phonological looping kind of process. And I was curious if you would say a little bit about how do you speak to yourself when you're designing? What is that like? Because each of you have demonstrated it in different ways and how you've talked about the ideas that animate you, but I'm curious if you could say what the experience is like.
I think it's an aesthetic response to form, and I would use my experience as a musician. Well, I think you're a musician as well. The way you might know that what you've played is right, and what's interesting is this, someone said something about musicians who play from sheet music that is not as creative as the composer's work who created the music that you are playing. And someone responded, I forget who, and saying, no, every note I make is a creative act. I make myriad decisions about its timing, tempo, intonation, whatever. And so each note, in fact, and in aggregate, is a creative act. I think it's something like that, where you're playing it against models that have formed in your mind, and the iteration, repetition is a part of that. So iterative work with form. Buckminster Fuller said, "If it's not beautiful, I'm not done." He was an engineer, but for me, it's formal in the sense of it's about form, and the aesthetic in the sense of those things that come to my senses. This sort of inadequate capacity I have to understand what's going on, and there are sort of classic formal models that we can judge a circle, for example, against. But there are also patterns of behavior, patterns of belief that we can map against. So I would go to form.
You know, as an architectural educator, I would say that one of the things that we do in a more traditional architectural education is we put little harpies on everybody's shoulders that are us, that are sitting there looking at the design for the rest of their lives going, oh, come on, you know, this is not good enough, or why are you doing something stupid like that, or something else. So there's a kind of, we try to build a critical capacity to a certain extent. Now I think that I've gotten rid of most of those guys. But I think I've got somebody who's almost as bad, and it's not Ranoff, but it's me. And a lot of times I'm looking at the way in which I do something, not necessarily the product. And I'm looking at how I might be successful or difficult in saying, what is it about the way you're thinking about this problem that produces the kind of results that you get? And how do you change the way you think about the problem in order to enable other kinds of results? So this is, and this way of thinking comes from Reynolds, but he's not sitting there.
And Alan Kay uses the phrase of good enough to criticize, which means there's a lot of work for which there's kind of rough tumbling around of things, which might be aleatory or sort of opportunistic, looking at what's there to regard.
Can I mention that you're all talking about conversation forms internally? And that's what Reynolds meant when he talks about the relationship to the pencil. He doesn't mean that the pencil is talking, but that you are taking alternative perspectives. This is what I made, what did I make? And that's an internal process.
I'd answer a little bit from I've witnessed Bill Forsyth creating his works, and you can see, the body of work that emerges from his rule-based generative stuff is very diverse. So it's much more diverse than, say, Balanchine, I think. There's joyous pieces, there's light pieces, there's heavy pieces, dark pieces, complex, so it's an extraordinary expansion of, and I'd say the same with a composer, Paul Steen, who's not to know quite well, a Canadian composer, again, trying to not write out his music, but to generate it through complex layered mechanics or systems. In both cases, you'll find Bill will release a sort of rule sets onto the chord of ballet, and he encourages them then to play through these sort of algorithms. And they record everything, they video record everything. And then he developed the capacity to read all of that videos, countless hours of video. In the evenings, he'd sit and watch it at high speed. And he learned how to read at high speed.
Wow. In
order that he could extend the amount of experiment that could go on. And it was amazing witnessing him, because I was laughing because these people are running around the stage, and he's like, did you see that? And then you slow it down, there's this exquisite moment, and he says, Balanchine never did that, And then comes the kind of historic knowledge, and I see it with the composer and with Forsyth, that they understand that they're fishing for something that is in some way exceeding that which has happened before. Mm-hmm. And they're fishing for that moment which they recognize that there's something to be had. Then the next morning he'll gather the whole corps de ballet and say, did you see these 2 or 3 moments from yesterday? Let's look at what caused those, and now try to generalize those rules and see if we can expand that.
It's not some,
and
yeah.
After 3 weeks, you suddenly got a completely differentiated kind of balletic repertoire going on.
One of the things you're describing is that there's not just one way of thinking. To say, oh, you think about, how do I think when I design? I don't know. Sometimes I don't think at all. And I just play. And there's, so I might be within an equation, and I might be, haphazardly playing with it. Or if I'm thinking about that, I might start sketching in the sense of thinking about, not in the sense of sketching of like a visual recording of it, but more so, well, let's see, if I was to flatten a shape and then twist it, what happens? If I reverse that process, then do I get something internalized? And but it becomes about matching the process, but then when you do it, it's very different, it's tacit, there's something else that happens. And then there's other times when you're like, I think I need to think for a few days. And you really think about what's going on.
I'd say there's a lot of playfulness in those groups, but they've generally started to play very seriously. So the interview with the documentary about Forsyth is called Not Just Dancing Around. And at some point he sort of says, we're not just dancing around, we're starting from a ground set of rules that we've thought about. So there's a seriousness and purpose to it. Even though there's a lot of invention, a lot of spiritedness that goes on, and it's clowning around, but it's
the idea of invention is not necessarily about the idea of seeking to produce something original, but produce something fitting for a situation that's unique. In other words, the originality of it comes from the uniqueness of the thing you're attending to, and that fitting response to that may end up being original. It may end up being a variation on a theme. Someone mentioned science and scientific research earlier. And I was reminded of this genome scientist who said scientists can't make anything happen that can't happen without them. And I thought, well, artists and designers do that all day long.
One of the questions behind, I think, this whole thing is Joe's question about education. And Ulmer phrases it very clearly. He said, "Can we teach invention? Can we teach invention?" And it's a profound question. And his response to it is to look back through history. So he's looking for heuretic educational pedagogy, not hermeneutic. And the hermeneutic is the dominant one. And heuretics used to be the twin of hermeneutics, but if you look it up in the dictionary, it's just sort of gone. So it's inventive intellection versus analytical education. Hermeneutics is this great kind of that sits there. But he says, throughout history there have been heuretic works, of course, where there's a sort of vision of an inventive future. Phaedrus is probably the oldest one. Breton's Surrealist Manifesto is another. And because he's a sort of literary theorist, he says all of the heuretic works that have succeeded in history have really resonate through time in enacting a change. So in inventing a new way of doing things, all contain the same elements. And they are, you need a clear contrast of what you're moving away from, infantry. So Plato hated the sophists and the whole polytheistic worldview. You need a target of what you're aiming for, so democratic democracy. So those are the sort of push and pull of the thing. So you set those up, and this is unattainable, this is like rejected, so they're both negatives. And he says you need an analogy to start your heuristic attempts at something, and then you need a theorist to articulate why. And then the form of the work has to enact between those four pushes and pulls. And so he uses this for his students as an acronym CAT: contrast, target, analysis, theory, and tail. So he sets that up as a kind of creative armature, which stops you doing what you want to do, and it forces you to have an intellectual armature to do something that is unexpected because you're setting this up. And he runs that on his students, and I found it very useful as an analytical tool. Like, is this student in front of me who's doing a creative thesis? Does it have all these elements? Is there a clear contrast to what it's rejecting, what it's aiming towards? Is there an analogy that is credible? Is there a theory as to why this is valid? And is the form of the work actually, instantiating that? And it's very good analytic, but it's also good as a creative armature. And I think all of the people I've mentioned, like Bill Forsyth, Paul Steenhuisen, James Joyce, Raymond Roussel, boy did they have a cat. I mean, they were extremely rigorous in how they set up the armature of invention. And so I do think it's not casually doodling for me. I'm sorry. It's the doodling comes on the basis of a very well constructed, prospective, heuretic armature, I think. And on that basis, you can then judge your results. So does this fall foul of any of my arguments, if you will?
An example of that would be something like surrealism, right? Which would appear to be super chaotic without some sort of really theoretical backing. But Breton, you mentioned Breton, and like he was transcribing what Freud was writing down about post-World War I PTSD, and you start to see like, oh, these sketches that were made and these moments of trauma are actually isolated moments, and they may not have something to do with the conscious or subconscious. It was another production. So even something like a surrealist painting, which I struggled with for a very long time until I realized, like, oh, there's a whole history here. Like most things that are new invention, that are rooted in like a theory about thinking. Right?
You mentioned clients and the client brief or the design brief from the client. The essence of most design briefs is like this but different. And in that difference lies the paradox of what they've just said, and also the difficulty of the project going forward, which is designers are people who present themselves when people don't know what to do and are comfortable in that condition.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely comfortable, and in fact enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what I would like to say first is that my favorite comment that I heard any of you say today was, what happened to the white space in the drawing? And the most thing that most impressed me about the visuals of seeing this conversation happen was the black and white character of it and your outfits.
I didn't get the memo.
No,
Right.
did not get
And how
it.
You
they
matched the
matched-
tablecloth, so
And
it's
how they matched
Can-
the very bounded thing on the wall, and actually the bounded nature of the conversation. And there were many very fascinating and interesting things said. Kind of the general tone and character of it had sameness to it, and it was very hard to follow sitting on this side of these chairs. And it was sort of mumble, 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 Spencer Brown, okay, that's good. Or there's the image of the canoe happening, and so on. It was invoked earlier in our conference last night and several other times. Since we invoked quite a few 20th century authors, the Luigi Pirandello, the 6 characters in search of in this case, of a theory of design or a conversation about design. And I was overwhelmingly curious during the entire presentation what your idea of designing this conversation was. Given the nature of my experience of how bounded it was and how it was happening there. So I was
What's your
curious.
name?
Oh, it's Art.
Art?
Holmes.
I think you're actually touching on like aesthetics, which we haven't talked much about in this conversation as designers. Like, we have an aesthetic up here that is black and white primarily, right? You're drawing an analogy between the drawings and what we're wearing and saying that it's kind of a package, right? There's a history in architecture about what architects wear, and it's about, there's a piece written by Lois, right? About wearing all black and how it kind of brings the conversation back to the content rather than what you're wearing or being distracted by what somebody's wearing. That's one of the points that he makes. But I think that there's something nice in the way that you're talking about us being a complete package and maybe seeming like we prepared really, really well for this. We did discuss, but not to this capacity. I mean, we got like a beer last night. Some of us did, half of us did. So.
And I was wondering if that was your design intention, of having it be a very useful conversation, or if you wanted it to swirl outward into the group, which it didn't do, so, or at least until now.
Well, I guess you could say that there was a thought for how one might organize a panel of this nature, and then there's what happens. And they weren't the same, that's for sure, but that's what happens.
Well, there's a theory that amoebas and bacteria and other things designed by what they do.
Yeah, but I think there's also just, we don't really care. So it's not something that needs to be directed. It doesn't have to go this way.
Yeah.
There was the possibility of structuring this in a much more concrete way.
Yeah.
We didn't go down that road, but we, starting with the quote, about conversation being a place where you might discover something. Why not see if we would discover something? That doesn't mean that you will discover something. That doesn't mean that it will go in any particular way. It just means that you have no will to control.
So
And this not controlling business is something that you've had conversations about in this conference before.
Yeah, and I think for me, this was more of an introduction than a conversation, an introduction to some people with whom I might continue a conversation. I pointed out the 2 people in the room that I've had conversations with, Paul, over a long period of time, an extensive conversation that's open-ended, and has all the markings of something which leaves what I would call sort of markings of endless beginnings. So with that in mind, it's sort of the article of faith that allows us to continue to think or believe that we will continue our conversation. I began by saying I've concluded a conversation, was which lasted 50 years with someone who just died. I don't think that conversation will continue, but internally, there's so much more there from that conversation that'll become a part of other conversations with Paul, for example. So the format, for example, just a panel built on this right angle. There are some architects involved, I guess. There's some right angle here. Sort of suggests a movement away from it. I wanted to say, do we need the table? Could we just move the chairs over and sit as we would in a circle, more like a conversation? But the other thing is, I don't find conversation something easy to undertake in the presence of people observing me. So this is kind of a performance. It's a spectacle. And with my friends here, we didn't really get a lot of eye contact during the time and that's something you read in conversation, body language, eye contact, and those are the context of what I would consider the kind of valuable conversation. And then we use the word conversation very broadly. You see two people speaking on the street and you say, well, they're having a conversation. Well, then there's a cybernetic analysis of what actually is transpiring between them and what you can make out of that, and that becomes a kind of a weighty matter. But the important thing, I think, is to understand the casual nature of conversation, and that there isn't an expectation that it is meant to resolve anything.
You know, based on many conversations I had with Ranulph for several years during the origin of the 2010 conference, which he was trying to find new forms for conferences and things, which is a passion of his, was a passion of his.
Well,
you know,
I don't want to take up any more time with my question, but I think my observation was meant to suggest that something of the geometry of the way you establish things was highly determinative of the design of the conversation that you had.
I agree completely.
That's all.
See, there's a Greg Ulmer who's outside of architecture. He's interested in this. He keeps saying to me, you architects have been involved in an experiment in creative pedagogy for 50 years, like no other. I mean, what you do to your students is a very, very unusual pedagogy across all the disciplines. Film, design, industrial design doesn't come close to the immersion in sort of cultural complexity that we lay on architects and the need to invent. And he said if you could theorize that, you'd be extremely influential, because everybody's looking for that embodied engagement, creative embodied engagement in pedagogy. And certainly the engineering department, even at MIT, just came and proposed engineering by design. But they don't really, and when you quiz them, they have no idea what they mean by it. And so you start having a conversation about, so what is it that we specifically know? And I think we architects have been terribly bad at theorizing that which we now know. You know, when you sit in a studio review, there's no discord about what you're witnessing, and it's the fulfillment of an intellectual trajectory that you can see as immersed itself and then arrived with an original form and the ability to articulate it is quite a remarkable new pedagogy. But we haven't yet theorized it adequately, and so I think you're absolutely right that we end up still in these sort of stilted conversations that are part nostalgic, part speculative, part mumbo jumbo, part theory. And I think the call is for us as an intellectual community to kind of get our shit together. And then we have great influence, I think.
There's a book, Doctrine of Signatures, by Scott Buchanan, in which he articulates distinctions between a studio, a clinic, and a laboratory, and also refers to the body as an artist. So it's worth looking at that. But you brought up the studio, and I think all of us we're implicitly thinking this is all about what happens in a studio. This is not a studio.
And also, dialogue, that is that Socratic thing that defined what literacy is and what the sort of analytical reason, non-contradictory analytical reason that is sort of worked through a dialogue. And I contest this is not that. When you engage the other creative dimension and it's fully multimedia, then the dialogue becomes a very impoverished form of addressing that intellect. But for damn sure it's a new form of intellect.
So Candy had a question before. He's still there.
And maybe a short one. What would you say is a good conversation?
Is it good conversation?
What is a good conversation?
One that never ends.
That's great.
I think there's conversations that, and collaborations which are formal conversations where you go places you could never go by yourself. So you grow and you understand something new and so on and so forth. If it's someplace you go by yourself and you're having that conversation with yourself, you're not making even very good progress. So I think it's generating something different.
The latter's called drinking your own bathwater.
Yeah, beer is better than
You know, the original conversation, Plato's Symposium, where it's a bunch of old guys talking about love after dinner. So and it's a series of soliloquies almost. And it goes around the table, of course, it ends with Socrates because he quietly deconstructs everybody else's thinking. And the point is really a sort of analysis moves to synthesis. And so at the end of the circuit, you've attained a much greater understanding, and Socrates was evidencing that's this new intellectual capacity that we're aspiring to. So I think the conversation is synthesis in the end. It's that you get lots of analysis and it comes to a greater fulfillment, which is you come out.
And I think, it improves the quality of life, in particular your own life. I mentioned to Joe that I flipped open a book that was laying around in my studio. It was Lin Yutang's book on the importance of living, and it opened up to the section on conversation, which describes a lot of more the Asian or Chinese view of conversation, and of utmost importance is the casual nature of it.
Which is different than dialogue then.
Yes.
The Socratic dialogue is definitely structured.
Yeah.
One thing for me, I guess, is, like this conversation was kind of intense. It was dense. There was a lot to digest. I don't know if I'm going to know how good this conversation is for some time. It's going to take me time to digest all that happened here. And I learned a lot, but there's a lot that before I can really say I learned it, I got to think about it quite a bit. Because there wasn't like we all had the exact same interpretation of cybernetics or even design, even though we're all we call ourselves designers. And so the contradictions are what's I think most interesting for me, because that's where there's an opportunity for me to learn and change the way I frame the way I look at the world. And so, I don't know, I think if it's getting me to think beyond today, that means this was a pretty good conversation for me.
I intend to be more heureutic.
There was a great moment when Alma came to MIT, and he's an old guy. His students call him Santa Claus from hell. And he sat down with one of my students, and she'd met him before, and so she starts saying, "Oh, how was your trip? How's Florida? What's the weather like?" And he just stopped. He says, "No. Okay, now I'm going to lay down a theoretical framework so that we can actually have a discussion. Otherwise, we'll spend the next hour just frittering our time away." So maybe that's the difference is. And he then did that. He did that. We're all like, whoa, okay. And it just, we're going to talk at this level. And it was a very interesting moment. And my experience of conversations, of chat, it doesn't usually get me very far.
Yeah.
I mean, you end up being social.
Yeah.
And I do. It's not often that you get into a context where somebody says, "No, here's a framework to talk about," and everybody then has to sort of try to come up to that level, and maybe that's the difference in a conversation. And it doesn't happen that often. In my experience, even at a place like MIT, it's very rare you have a conversation.
Sandy Stone said that the chat rooms that are most interesting on the internet, assuming they still exist, were the quiet ones, where people knew each other so well, no one had to say much, but when they did, it meant a lot.
Yes.
So one of the things that's going to come out of this is in about a couple of weeks, you guys are going to get a transcript of this conversation. So I would like to know if you will agree to annotate the transcript of the conversation so that we can exchange that amongst you.
Wow.
And in some way have yet the conversation reflecting back upon itself, because I think that will be very helpful in terms of what the cybernetic principles are that go with it, as well as the fact that this is in theory a conference on resilience, and so we're going to try to extend the resilience of your conversation by giving it an opportunity to continue, grow, and thrive.
Excellent.
Okay.
I think that one of the things that happens in a conversation like this is that it goes from this place to this place to this place to this place to this place. It doesn't go here, it doesn't go here. It could have gone here, it didn't go there. And so the other potential branches might be something that could come out in a second layer or a third
Yep.
or 15th layer of the conversation.
Mesh.
Yeah. Make a mesh out of it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.